Isang lunti ang Pilipinas sa ating lahat. I'm happy to see that this year's Climate Change Consciousness Week has chosen its theme, Sama-samang tumutugon sa hamon ng nagbabagong panahon. We all face the inescapable truth that the threat of climate change is a race against time. No single action will stop global warming, and so we need the concerted efforts of all levels in government, academe, businesses, civil society, local governments, the youth, our local communities to accelerate progress on the shared challenges of climate change. This Climate Change Consciousness Week is one among 15 we have had in the past. What makes this different, however, is that first, we know much more about reducing risk than 10 or 15 years ago. Second, we are on the road to recovery from a most unexpected disaster, the COVID-19 crisis. Consequently, we have new questions to answer. How do we learn the lessons of the pandemic? How do we contend with rising poverty, urbanization, the food crisis? How do we take on climate change with new lenses? Disaster has no boundaries. It affects everyone, but most especially the most vulnerable and marginalized groups. For our country, this means our coastal communities, our farmers, fisher folks, urban poor, indigenous communities, rural women and children. When disaster strikes, they are hit the hardest. The most vulnerable are left with even less to enable them to cope with and recover from the impacts of a disaster. We do know that the Philippines ranks high on most global indices for vulnerability to climate change and natural hazards. That is why, in the last 2 decades, climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction have been central priorities for legislation. As early as 2009, we enacted RA 9289, the Climate Change Act that created this commission. Notably, the Philippines is the second country in the world after the United Kingdom to enact a climate change law. We also have the Philippine Disaster Risk Reduction Management Act in 2010. The law has played an important role in shifting the country's focus from disaster response to more proactive disaster risk reduction and preparedness. The DREAM Act has strengthened the institutional capacity for climate adaptation in DRM of national and local governments. We have the Clean Air Act, Ecological Solid Waste Management Law, Renewable Energy Act, Environmental Awareness Education Act, many more. Our vulnerability leaves us no choice but to have these laws and policies in place and to see their successful implementation. But how do we effectively implement laws and policies? We have climate change mitigation and adaptation policies, and yet when disaster strikes, we suffer. Our communities and ecosystems suffer immensely. I would like to highlight climate change consciousness, climate literacy. There's a study in 2013 by Streisand, Lutz, and Pat on the effects of educational attainment on climate risk vulnerability. Their study included 125 countries over 10 years. The main conclusion of this study is that education as an investment in adaptive capacity has to be seen as a new policy focus. According to the study, and I quote, better education implies better access to relevant information, like early warnings for tropical storms or seasonal prediction of drought. Second, that education enhances cognitive skills and a willingness to change risky behavior while at the same time extending planning horizon, unquote. UNICEF also has the same conclusion about the vulnerability of children to climate risk. Providing children with empowering and relevant education on disasters and climate change can reduce their vulnerability to risk while contributing to sustainable development for communities. Educating girls and women is one of the best ways to strengthen community adaptation to climate change, as shown by recent studies. Our task now is to ensure that our investment in climate education is a form of adaptation We need to effectively explain to communities and individuals how their climate is changing, how they should adapt in ways that effectively integrate climate risks into the development process. The need for intensive climate education integrated into compulsory education is underscored in the United Nations Conference of Parties, COP, the highest decision-making body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC. We have responded to the call for climate change education pursuant to the Climate Change Act, which I enacted in 2009, the Enhanced Basic Education Act of 2013, or the K-12 Act, strengthened curriculum integration of climate change concepts across grade levels. We also have the integration of gulayan sa paaralan, solid waste management, tree planting under the National Greening Program in our schools. However, we need more than just the integration of climate change concepts or dream into our curriculum. Let us intensify climate literacy and support climate action across all sectors. Our poorer communities face barriers to free and easy communication. Better information on climate change is a priority, given the very low level of climate information available. Better information should also come with effective communication of this information. One question to answer during CCC Week is, how do we speak the language of our most vulnerable communities? Climate education is now imperative. It is time to step up. I would like to see a climate literate nation and that each Filipino starts to become proactive in championing resilient and sustainable households, businesses, communities. Nature-based solutions should be taught to every Filipino. These are solutions that protect, sustainably manage, or restore natural ecosystems. Empty promises, procrastination, and neglect have already claimed hundreds of thousands of lives. It is time to bring the era of inaction to a close. We need education and climate literacy to face the climate crisis head-on. Let our bold climate actions reveal that we are firm in our resolve to turn climate commitments into action and thus deliver on our promise to save this planet for future generations. Once again, maraming salamat, isang lunti ang Pilipinas sa ating lahat.